For my research project, I decided to research the Jewish American community in the United States. In Jim Camp's article, Jewish Americans, he writes, Jewish Americans represent a group of people rather than a distinct race or ethnicity. What binds the group together is a common Jewish heritage as passed down from generation to generation. Jewish settlers have been arriving on American shores since 1654, with many of the other earlier colonials that were coming here. Like the other groups of people that were coming from Europe, they were searching for religious freedom. What was a little bit different for the Jewish community, though, was it was a lot harder for them to find religious freedom throughout centuries because many people had anti-Semitic views towards them, which is the prejudice or hostility against Jewish people. In Joellen Zolman's article, she describes the Jewish migration in America as a wave of three different ways. She talks about how the first wave of Jewish migration came before the Revolutionary War, and it was mostly Jews that were coming from Spain or Portugal. However, this changed by like the middle of the 1800s when the Jews started coming from Germany due to prosecution, restrictive laws, and economic hardships. By the beginning of World War I, there were over 250,000 German Jews living in the United States. And by this time, they were outnumbering the Spanish Jewish population. This shifted again, though, by the late 1880s and continued through the 1920s as many of the European Jews were fleeing from Russia, Romania, Austria, Hungary, and Poland. The American Jewish community was not defined by any one ethnicity, but rather than a community that was built on faith and a sense of tradition. By the end of the 1920s, there was over 2 million Eastern European Jews that were now in the United States. PBS put out a mini-series called The Jewish Americans by David Grubin, and he talks about the Jewish lifestyle of the Jewish Americans when they came here. During the mid-19th century and through World War II, many of the Jewish Americans were living in big cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland, where they were hoping to find jobs in factories and steel mills. A lot of them settled in communities that were small communities, part of that city that was just a Jewish community, and they were living in very tight quarters because that's all they could afford. So there were several families living in a couple of rooms that they shared. But the Jewish people that came here, they were very willing to easily blend into American culture. They wanted to learn English, they wanted to be educated, they were willing to work hard, and they started to thrive. They grew in business, in government, law, and as they were growing and thriving, some of the attitudes towards them was beginning to change. And a lot of people began to stereotype Jews as dirty, greedy people who only cared about money and wanted to take over jobs. In 1915, there was an Atlantic business owner, Leo Frank, who owned a pencil company, and a young factory worker, Mary Flagan, who worked there, was killed. He was convicted of her murder and sentenced to death, and there was very little evidence to even prove that he had anything to do with it. Before they could even carry out his death sentence, there was an angry mob that came and lynched him. In the PBS series, Grubin explains that though this was an isolated tragedy, it rippled a ripple effect of fear for decades to come. Years later, in 1986, Frank would finally be pardoned for a murder that he never committed because there was sufficient evidence to prove he had nothing to do with it. But because of this incident, there was widespread fear that spread throughout the United States. The Ku Klux Klan became much more popular again, and by 1920, there was over 4 million members of the Ku Klux Klan. While they're very well known for some of their violent behavior towards African Americans, they were also this way towards American Catholics and the American Jews by destroying property, burning crosses, things like that. But what was probably even scarier at this time was the fact that there was people like Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh who were considered American heroes that had a very outspoken hatred of Jews. Henry Ford was known as a self-made American millionaire. He was responsible for the huge car industry in the United States. But he started his own newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, and he freely wrote a lot of articles displaying his hatred of Jews. He blamed economic hardships in the United States on the Jewish community. He just flat out hated them. Charles Lindbergh was another. He liked Adolf Hitler and was said to admire him because he thought he was on the right path of how Jewish people should be treated. So considering that these were two people that were considered American heroes, and that Ford was being considered to run for the presidency of the United States, they were very influential. And this was kind of scary for the way that the views towards the Jews were going. But World War II kind of changed all that. With the World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, people were starting to realize how wrong the hatred of Jews were. And by the end of the war, there was over 6 million Jews from Europe that were killed. That made the United States, with a population of 5 million, the largest Jewish population of any one country in the world. There's no denying how much influence that the Jewish community has had on America. According to Mark Schultz in his article, New York Jews Won't Stop Winning Nobel Prizes, the amount of Jewish New Yorkers who have won the Nobel Peace Prize in a variety of fields far exceeds their tiny proportion of the overall population. By 2012, there were 37 Jewish winners of the Nobel Prize in such fields as medicine, economics, and chemistry, and 32 of those were Jewish Americans who were born in New York City. Jewish Americans have prospered in other fields too, like government, law, business, art, music, and film. Such influential American Jews are Henry Kissinger, the 56th Secretary of State, Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, the CEO of Starbucks, Henry Schultz, and the clothes designer Ralph Lauren. The American Jewish community has prospered throughout the film and music industry, and there's so many famous people in Hollywood and New York film that there's too many to even name, and some of them include directors Steven Spielberg and Woody Allen, actors Harrison Ford and Billy Crystal, Elizabeth Taylor, Marilyn Monroe, and singer-songwriters Bob Dylan and Barbra Streisand. Like I said, they were very well known in the Hollywood community, in music industry. It's kind of become one of the characteristics that people think of Jewish people, that they must be artistically talented, or they're very smart, or they have a really good head for business. What some people may not know, like they know the famous people, a lot of them that I've named, or Jerry Seinfeld is a famous Jewish comedian, but they might not know that Elvis Presley was of Jewish descent, or that Ruth Handler, who was the former president of Mattel Toys and the inventor of the Barbie doll, was also Jewish. So a lot of people hated the Jews and were weary of them and didn't know anything about them because their faith and their traditions are so different from their own. But when you think about it, they're really not that much different than anybody else's. While most Christians celebrate or reserve Sunday as a holy day, Jews do it on Saturday, which is the Sabbath for them. We have our traditional holidays such as Christmas and Easter. They have theirs that are Hanukkah and Rosh Hashanah, which is a Jewish New Year. Their holy text is the Torah, where most Christians have the Bible. Instead of having a preacher, they have a rabbi. There's some of the other traditions, like a child's first Holy Communion in the Catholic faith. They have a bar mitzvah in the Jewish faith. So a lot of things are very similar. But while some of the Christian traditions are still old school, some of the Jewish ones are starting to revolutionize a little bit. For example, a Catholic priest still cannot marry. He's never been able to marry, but a rabbi can. And a rabbi can also now be a woman. The first woman rabbi was Sally Preston in 1972, who's from Cleveland, Ohio. So the Jewish community has really thrived in America. They've become a part of the American culture, and they may not even consider just their religion as part of who they are, but it's more of their traditions, a common history, and the traditions that they share.